Hey everybody, it's Mr. Lavassa with you, and we have a lesson from Ms. Johnson's class about racial slavery and the long-term effects of slavery that's in America. And we'd like to look today at how COVID-19 and how people getting seriously ill from COVID-19 can be related to um, the history of slavery in this country. We're also going to look at some math, and that will be proportions and percents, because we're going to see some graphic information and some tables, and they will show us who gets seriously ill from COVID. And we'll look at those in graphic form and as a table. All right, let's take out that assignment, please. Okay, here we are. Here's the assignment. The unit is racial slavery, and the topic of this lesson is COVID-19 and the legacy of slavery. And if you click on that link, it will take you to an ABC News broadcast on the same topic. So our content objectives are to read the article, view a video, and discuss why COVID-19 potentially infects why COVID-19 proportionally infects all Americans evenly, but being sick from COVID disproportionately affects people of color. So everyone in the United States is just as likely to catch COVID-19, to be infected by COVID-19, but not everybody is as likely to become seriously ill from the disease. And we'll be working on language skills, reading, writing, listening, speaking, and analyzing language. And we'll look at a few math topics, percents and proportionality, and also analyzing graphs and tables. Here we have a link to this video that you're watching now. Please remember to start and stop this video as you see fit so that you can use this to learn and complete this assignment. Our learning objectives. I can define proportional as a relationship or comparison between things in a predictable ratio. I can define disproportional as a comparison between things not fair, reasonable, or expected. Because there's too large or too small a relationship between the things. We want to be able to analyze information for main ideas, analyze readings, watch the video, and analyze information for main ideas. And I can analyze graphic information or graphic data for proportions and ratios. So in section 2, there's a link to a video, a news video made in Europe by a French broadcaster. It's in English. But they talk about different reasons why African Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, why African Americans are getting sicker than other Americans based on some facts. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch the video, and I want you to list 5 of the reasons or 5 of the facts about why African Americans are at greater risk to being seriously ill from COVID than other Americans. And what we'll see as we look at the data from ABC and from the Centers for Disease Control, what we'll see is that the most vulnerable population are Native Americans, Hispanics or Latino, and then African Americans. Everybody is just as likely to be infected, but how severe it is, there are some things. There are some social and economic factors, and the history of slavery and the history of the way that Native Americans have been treated in this country that are tied to how seriously sick you get from this disease. In section 3, I want you to consider and discuss in your groups how these 5 facts that we just listed based on the video may be linked to the legacy of racial slavery. So we want to write complete sentences, 1 or 2 sentences about our discussion and about this video and why those 5 factors that make African Americans more likely to get seriously ill from the disease than whites in America, and how that might be connected to racial slavery. Section 4 is a reading, okay, and we're going to highlight 4 factual mathematical data related to COVID, and we're going to highlight that with yellow. So I'm going to take out my yellow highlighter right now, and I'm going to give you a sample of that. So here's my yellow highlighter. I'm going to start reading it with you. Read and highlight using functional language analysis. Main ideas. COVID-19 proportionally infects all Americans evenly. However, COVID-19 disproportionately affects people of color regarding hospitalization rates and death rates. Question: can this disparity be linked to the legacy of racial slavery in America? Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in February of 2020, the nation's health inequalities have become more glaring, with millions of Americans of color, Black, Latino, and in particular Native Americans, experiencing more severe illness and death due to COVID-19 than white Americans. Data from the United States Center for Disease Control, CDC, shows that there's approximately a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio for COVID-19 infection rates between white, Latino, and Black. So for every 1 white, 1 Latino, and 1 Black, so there's an even rate, 1-to-1-to-1 of infection. However, the rate of hospitalization between these groups of Americans is 1 white to 2.9 Black to 3 Latino. So African Americans and Hispanic Americans are about 3 times more likely to be hospitalized than white Americans because of COVID. The death rates of 1 to 1.9 to 2.3. This data reveals that Blacks and Latinos are essentially 3 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 than whites, and that Blacks and Latinos are essentially twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than whites. And I'm going to highlight that because that's mathematical facts. New data reveals that the same racial and ethnic disparities which have affected adults throughout the pandemic also extend to children of color. Black, Latino, and Native children have been affected by more COVID-19 related illness and death than other children. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to find an English synonym or a translation of all of these words on the right. Proportional, disproportional, pandemic, inequalities, and infection rate. I would like a translation or a synonym for all of those words. Moving on to section 5. Here we see a table, a data table from the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. And below that, we see an ABC News graph of percentages, and that their source is also the CDC. Let's read the instructions. Study and discuss the data table and graph below with your group. Answer questions about the data table below. Main ideas. This data table compares ratios or proportions of likelihood of infection, hospitalization, and death for people of color, Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Latinos, compared to white, non-Hispanic Americans. For example, data show that Native Americans are essentially twice as likely to be infected by COVID-19 than other American ethnic groups. So essentially, here's that data. So for every one white American, 1.9 Native Americans get sick. Or for every one white American, 0.7 fewer Asians get sick. For every one white American, 1.1 blacks or African Americans. So essentially the same ratio. And as far as Latino persons, 1.3. So Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans all are about 1 to 1 to 1. Native Americans are almost twice as likely to be infected by this disease. And then underneath, we see the hospitalizations. 3, 3.2, 2.9, 1.1, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. Look at that. Look how much more the chances of a Native American being hospitalized, and these are all compared against white Americans. So this is we just assume that the white Americans are 1 for all of these numbers. And the death rate, 2.4 for 2.4 times more likely to die for Native Americans. Same percentage, or 1 times as likely, essentially the same number for Asian Americans, 1.9 or twice as likely for Black Americans, and 2.3 for Hispanics or Latinos. So here we have a graph from ABC. 50% of the cases of COVID for children. This graph is showing children ages 5 to 17. 50% are white American children, and there are about 50% of the country is white American children. 47.4% of those children, of American white children, are likely to die from the disease. Over here, Hispanics, just about 27% or 26% of American children are Latino. So that number is proportional. 25.4% chance of death. So there's less chance of death for Latinos. Let's look at African Americans. 11.2% of the children cases are African Americans. 16.8 or almost 17% chances of death from COVID. So an increase for African American children who catch a chance of dying from this if African American children catch this disease. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read these questions and answer them. I did a sample one for you here. What is the actual ratio between rate of infection for Native Americans and African Americans? So rate of infection between Native Americans and African Americans. So there we go, 1.9 to 1.1. And that was the answer given here. And I'd like you to answer the rest of this. And let's just jump down to the last question. Viruses are obviously not prejudiced or racist. Viruses don't think. There's no prejudice, there's no racism in how a virus attacks somebody or something. But based on these numbers, we can see that the rate of illness is not proportional. So let's think, what can explain these disproportional ratios of severe illness in Americans? And I'd like you to answer that question. And that will lead us into our next lesson, which we'll write a paragraph about this. Thank you so much for your attention.